Okay. Well, hello everyone, all of you who've logged on so far, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Poppy Bowers. I'm exhibition curator and currently head of exhibitions at the Whitworth here in Manchester. And together with my colleague Olivia Heron, curator at the Whitworth, Lindsay Young, curator of contemporary British art at Tate Britain, and Susa Vlaskova, assistant curator at Tate Britain, we have set up the British Art Network research group, Art and the Women's Movement in the UK, 1970 to 1990. And this research group is prompted by an upcoming exhibition that will open at Tate Britain in November called Women in Revolt, Art, Activism and the Women's Movement in the UK, 1970 to 1990. And that's curated by Lindsay with support from Susa at Tate Britain. So all four coordinators of the group are on this call tonight, and we'll each host parts of the event so you get to know who we are. I have the pleasure of starting this welcome, and then Susa will introduce the research group and the exhibition, and also tonight's speakers. Olivia, who's also here, will facilitate the Q&A at the end of the conversation. And Lindsay is currently in Northern California on a residency, the lucky thing. So we'll be contributing as her internet connection will allow, and will likely contribute to some of the discussion towards the end. But tonight is really about hearing from two incredible speakers who, through their respective bodies of work, have helped vocalise, complicate and give shape to feminist analysis, cultural studies and decolonial thinking within art and visual culture. And I'm really pleased to welcome Griselda Pollock and Sutapa Biswas to share their experiences and reflections with us this evening. So thank you both again for joining us. This is the first event as part of the Art and the Women's Movement Research Network, and we're starting by way of mapping out some of the social, political and artistic contexts that we're looking back to, and in a way to help us consider what it means to enter into it now at a different moment. So I'm sure tonight we'll begin a very generative conversation and create some points of entry for us to take further into future discussions and events within this network. So before I hand over to Susa to introduce the talk more fully, I'll just run through a couple of ways in which you can engage with the session as we go. So after the conversation between Griselda and Sutapa, there will be a Q&A session for you all to contribute. So you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. And if you'd like to access closed captions, I can see that some of you have already, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And then finally, it's just a reminder to keep your microphone switched off so that we don't experience any unexpected interruptions. So with that, I'll just say enjoy the evening and thank you again for joining us, and I'll pass over to Susa.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. So, as Poppy has already said, this research group is loosely connected to the exhibition, Women in Revolt, in short, and it will open at Tate Britain on the 7th of November. We're hoping it's going to tour to Whitworth and then to the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh. And so focusing on feminist practices from this period, in terms of the research group, we have had just kind of three simple questions that we were starting with, or taking them as starting points that we were interested in. Who were the artists who were making work in this period, and how were they connected to one another? What was the impact of the socio-political movements and moments of the time to the artwork that was created in terms of material, working processes and dissemination of the work? And why are these stories so hard to find? What and who led to the artists and their artworks disappearing from public view? Carrying out research and studio visits towards the show, it was really important to us that we reach a wide range of women's voices that have been underrepresented, marginalized, or in many cases entirely denied their place in art historical debate, and especially in the context of mainstream exposure. Showcasing the work of over 100 women artists and collectives, it will be one of the largest surveys at Tate, and yet we know that despite the number, it will not be exhaustive. The show will be approached from an intersectional and trans-inclusive perspective as much as possible. And it will be the first time in the UK that this multitude of creative artistic identities and different practices and different vantage points will be brought together in one place. At the heart of the show is the desire to rebalance the visibility afforded specifically to women artists whose work was perceived as challenging in an era that was hostile towards women in general. The project has been in the making long before Hannah Marsh and myself joined the women. Hannah is the other assistant curator, we forgot to say, before we joined the team. And it's because for the curator, Lindsay Young, it is as political as it is deeply personal, partly dedicated to her mom. When Lindsay started tracking down and connecting with a vast number of women artists featuring on her kind of crazy mind map, she would keep hearing about the barriers and the difficulties they faced, but she also was able to draw strength from those encounters and feel the infectious energy of the stunning and powerful work these artists were making in the face of oppression and rejection. Leaving then Lindsay with the tough and unenviable task of making a selection that holds kind of the different stories together was being as comprehensive and as fair as possible. She often jokes that she's seen enough amazing work to fill the whole of Tate Britain, not just the Limbury galleries. And to explain the reason why I'm not showing you selection of images or artworks is because it would be really hard to privilege one artist over another. And what we're trying to do with the show is to highlight the solidarity, the common denominations, and to present kind of constellations and collectives of artists rather than stars. And the result promises to be a display of a huge range of artworks across different media, from painting, drawing, and photography, through textile sculptures, banners, and installations, to moving image and performance. It will be organized chronologically and thematically, positioning the art in the socio-political context. There will be a large amount of archive material which will point to the struggles at stake, as well as the strength, resistance, and the creative and subversive power that was being deployed. The exhibition will start with the works created at the time of the formation of the women's liberation movement, marking the beginning of the second phase of feminism in the UK. This will be followed by a room titled A Woman's Place, looking at the domestic environment as a place of entrapment, as well as the site of complex subjectivities of motherhood. The punk room will highlight the involvement of feminist artists in the movement and will be followed by a room focusing on the role of women in the campaigns for nuclear disarmament, as well as ecofeminism. The penultimate room will explore the moment of the formation of the discourse on Black feminist creativity in the context of the National Black Art Convention, as well as showcasing activities by South Asian women artists and collectives. And the last room will include works promoting lesbian visibility against the backdrop of homophobic legislation such as Clause 28. And we will finish with the end of the 1980s with the closure of the GLC and other cultural shifts that had a profound impact. And in a way, this is a point of contention to a certain extent, because of course there is a desire for kind of ending on a high and a positive, but we don't necessarily feel that it would be appropriate, and certainly not to the period in question, and arguably from today's perspective neither. So we also feel that overall there is kind of such a swelling of energy and power in these individual singular works that they're absolutely celebratory in their own right. And I just wanted to say that we're also very excited that the different nuances of the cultural and artistic landscape will be teased out in the catalogue essays by Stella Dadzier, Alice Correa, Ash Reed, Juliet Jacks, Rachel Garfield, and Amy Tobin. And Rosie Oliver is working with us on a 6-part podcast that will run alongside the show, kind of bringing us the voices, the actual voices of the artists. And we're also grateful to Lucy Reynolds, who will curate the moving image section with us. And of course, to Griselda Pollock, Marilyn Smith, and Althea Greenan, who have offered support and shared critical feedback as advisors on the exhibition framework. So this was just a very kind of brief and rushed through introduction, if you like kind of sharing of what's the main ideas behind the show. And yeah, I wasn't presenting it through images for kind of obvious reasons, as I said. And so I would be happy now to welcome and introduce one of our advisors and one of the artists in the show, Griselda Pollock and Sutapa Biswas. Griselda Pollock is Professor Emerita of Social and Critical Histories of Art at the University of Leeds and 2020 laureate of the Holberg Prize. A transdisciplinary scholar and feminist art historian, she was born in South Africa and grew up in Canada, moving to UK as a teenager. She studied modern history at Oxford and history of European art at the Coulthard Institute of Art in 70 to 72. And she joined the University of Leeds as a lecturer of history of art and film in 1977 and was appointed to the chair of social and critical histories of art in 1990. In 2001, she founded the Center for Cultural Analysis, Theory and History, intersecting with the perspectives of class, gender, sexuality, post-colonial critique, and queer theory. In 2007, with Max Silverman, Pollock initiated the research project Concentrationary Memories, the Politics of Representation, which explored the cultural resistance to totalitarian terror through the study of traumatic histories of the 20th century. Author of monographs of Mary Cassatt and Charlotte Solomon, as well as essays on Eva Hesse, Louis Bourgeois, and Georgia O'Keeffe. Most crucial to our project is her classic work of radical feminist art history, Old Mistresses, Women, Art and Ideology from 1981, co-authored with Roshika Parkar, which was followed then by, if you can see, Framing Feminism, Art and the Women's Movement in 1970s to 1985, charting the major events and debates in the early years of feminist art practice in UK. And this kind of brings us to the time when Griselda Pollock and Sutapa Biswas would meet at Leeds. Sutapa Biswas was born in Shantiniketan in West Bengal and moved to England with her family at the age of 4. She graduated in 1985 with a BA in Fine Art with Art History at the University of Leeds. She has a postgraduate degree from the Slade School of Art and was a research student at the RCA between 1996 to 1998. In 2008, Biswas was Andrew W. Mellon Fellow at the Yale Centre for British Art and is currently a Reader Fine Art at Manchester Metropolitan University. She was a recipient of the Yale Centre for British Art Visiting Scholars Award in 2019 to 20, during which she undertook research towards her film Lumen, weaving the thread of a matrilineal migratory journey and reflecting on displacement and longing. The film fiercely subverts the prevalent grand narratives. Biswas's recent solo shows at Kettlesy Art and the Baltic highlighted the poetry, richness, and conceptual integrity of her artistic practice, spanning painting, drawing, sculpture, photography, and video. But Biswas is not only acclaimed for her art practice, exploring questions of identity, race, and gender in relation to space and history, or for her vital involvement with the Black British arts movement, but also for having astutely challenged and instigated critical shifting of the Eurocentric understanding of post-war British art and its discourse, while still a student at Leeds. We are delighted that in our show we are able to include two of her iconic works, Kali from 1983 to 5 and Housewives with Steak Knives from 1985, both of which stunningly exemplify the questions she was raising in relation to race, class, labor, and gender in a post-colonial context. So now I would be delighted to hand over to Sutapa and Griselda for their in-conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely and warm introduction.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very historic set of photographs from stills, which reminds us that actually Sutapa Biswas and I have been in conversation since the beginning of the 80s, when she tells me I first met her off the bus and took her for her first interview to come to the School of Fine Art. Sutapa was a completely transformative student in the sense that she created an environment which challenged us, critiqued us, famously demanded that I respond to change my own teaching in order that her world and her experience and artists like her would be included. So I'm forever grateful to Sutapa for my education, as much as I hope that I contributed to creating an environment in which she could sustain something. And it's really, really crucial to see this picture of Sutapa as this extremely young student. She's 19, 20, 21 in the years. She's contesting with some of the sort of big figures of conceptual art like Terry Atkinson, and the social history of art like Tim Clark and Fred Orton and others, and created one of the truly most remarkable things. When I see Carly, I am shocked and shattered each time that she literally sitting there facing you with a painting of the British flag behind her and part of the film is confronting the entire question of who is visible, who is heard, whose stories are told, what is our art history, what is going on in our art education, and what are any of us doing in response to the realities of empire, colonialism, racism, as well as these urgent questions around class and gender. And within that extended context, it's very important that we do not isolate feminism and gender from other issues at all. Anyway, so it's an enormous honor to have been invited to be part of this. And I think one of the prompts, which I must set off, which was I did give a lecture in 2013 in response to a cluster of exhibitions around 2007, when people first began to think what had happened in this radical moment of rethinking art and social practice and the ways we had of talking about it. So there was WAC in America, Art and the Feminist Revolution. There was Konst feminism, art feminism in Sweden. There would be Elle à Centre Pompidou, which was a big survey. So France, Sweden, in fact the Netherlands, and United States all took on this history. But I said at the time, Britain never would. And I did some interviews about this. And so we are now at a point where the Tate Britain, and under Susanna and Lindsay and Hannah, we will finally get an exhibition. And what is so interesting, it's a different generation. It's a generation not between myself and, let's say, Sutapa. We're quite close in age. I was only about 5 or 6 years or 7 years older than Sutapa when I was teaching her. I was a little rookie art historian at the time as well. But also, in a sense, it's not just the 90s, it's not the mid-noughties, but it's really now into the second decade of the 20th century. So why so late? But at the same time, it's crucially wonderful that it's happening now, because so many new insights, so many new questions are coming. So when I said I don't think an exhibition like this could happen in Britain, it's because there are new curators. There are people who've been influenced by feminism and interested in its history to put it back onto the stage. So that's where my position starts. And in the 1970s, when I first started, which is just a little bit more context, the moment of two things. One is the shock at realizing that women had been completely written out of the history of art in the 20th century in their own presence. This is crucial. This is not old fuddy-duddies from the 19th century who were a bit, it's the leading curators of the Metropolitan Museum of Contemporary, on the Contemporary Curator. It's the Museum of Modern Art. It's the Tate. It's everybody is seeing that men and women are working side by side, all different cultures, etc., and they are selecting only one group to be, for the public, the history of art. So the first question was how to challenge that. The second question is that this was a very complicated issue, not as simple and straightforward as that. So that was the position I was in the 80s, and then I want to give the sort of, as it were, the microphone over to Sutapa, as if she was in this moment, about how she came to make Carly, what she thought was happening that shaped her art experience as coming into being an artist in an environment such as we had at Leeds, with its strengths and its weaknesses, and in terms of British art. So Sutapa, would you like to take up the experience of what it was like in art school in the 1980s and what you brought to shake it up, as it were, as well as what we offered to support you?
Thank you, and also thank you for that wonderful introduction. I mean, I think it's absolutely true to say that I of course learned a great deal from. I was so privileged and lucky to be at Leeds at the time. And I have to be honest in saying that, you know, one of my main reasons for applying to Leeds was because I was so interested that, you know, a musical band like the Gang of Four could come out of that department. And it just struck me that there was something very unusual about Leeds. But obviously, when I arrived, I think it's important to maybe mention in brief that, you know, I am the daughter of Indian parents who underwent partition. And, you know, my father was an academic. He taught at Shantiniketan at Tagore's Institute and at the university there. And so both my parents lived through a very particular period in colonial histories. And so I arrived at Leeds with this background and, you know, with a really deep hunger to think about art, I believe, in the context of a wider framework, something that connected with histories that related to the global South as much as it was relevant to the global North, if you like. So that kind of intersection of the spaces. And, you know, none of what I was able to achieve absolutely would have been achievable without the support. And actually, you know, it's very strange to use that word love, isn't it? But I was very blessed and, you know, so lucky that my tutors were generous enough to listen to my questions, you know, and to make space for my questions. I'm not saying that was easy, but on my part, but also I always felt that we saw each other, even though there were very clear differences, on some sort of, you know, on a kind of equal standing. So I felt that when I arrived at the University of Leeds, I was really shocked I mean, first of all, it was amazing to see. I hadn't studied art history previous to arriving. And, you know, it was really quite something to be immersed in the Rupert Beckett Lecture Theatre, which was like an old, you know, cinema with a massive screen. And to see projected on that scale images of Turner's Slave Ship, for example, or Manet's Olympia. And in the case of, you know, Turner's paintings, for, you know, there to be a conversation or a discussion, a dialogue around the use of palette, you know, the evocative nature of the brushstrokes, but nobody was talking about what was in the water. And I felt what was in the water because I was able to bring to that discourse the kind of history that I had absorbed and heard about from my parents, really, and or through the lens of my parents' experience, but also through the kinds of literature that I had been exposed to through my father predominantly. So it was a really difficult. It was quite shocking. And I think that in order to really try to challenge it, I had to, you know, there was a student who was one of my peers, Adrian. I forget Adrian's second name. And he at the time, he was a very talented artist. He at the time was making screen prints in which he was trying to liberate the characters in his, the subjects of his screen prints. So, for example, he was dealing with the subject matter of the Soweto riots, the photographic images from that time, the protests in Gdansk, the union protests. And amongst that sort of, selection of images that he was working with, he also made a screen print of Manet's Olympia. And in order to liberate Olympia from the context of the painting, what he did was to offer little speech bubbles to Olympia. And lo and behold, the pussycat, the cat, who sits at the foot of Olympia. But of course, Laura, the maidservant, was given none. And this really, apart from surprise me and shock me deeply, I had to really try to understand how it was that he could see, what was happening in the Soweto riots, but he couldn't see Laura. And so in that context, I went back to the literature that we were exposed to at the time through yourself in Theories and Institutions, Griselda, and, to T.J. Clarke's writing about Manet's Olympia. And it dawned upon me that, and this is in conjunction with what I was experiencing through my art history lectures, really, that the reason that my fellow student had not seen Olympia in part was because T.J. Clarke had failed to see Laura. And so it became very important for me. And I wrote about this, if you recall, Griselda, in my dissertation. This is the starting point of my undergraduate dissertation, where I look for the causal kind of relationships that have instigated a kind of failing to deal with the kinds of issues that relate to questions of class, gender, race, and sexuality in relation to capital. And, of course, at the same time, I was looking at, paintings of Vermeer in my art historical lectures by Tony Hughes and Diane. I forget Diane's name at the moment, but second name at the moment. But, and when I saw Vermeer's Woman in Blue reading a letter, again, it took me right back to, that image of my mother reading a letter on aerogram when we arrived in Britain, wearing a blue sari. And I must have only been about 5 at the time when that happened. I had come to England when I was 4. And when I came back to Vermeer's painting, which was actually probably one of the first paintings that ever really stayed with me as a young child. I think I encountered that in a Reader's Digest manual when I was about 5, maybe 6. And so when all of these different factors and Old Mistresses, which was absolutely pivotal to opening up discourses around feminist ideology and practice. I arrived in 1981 as a student, and Old Mistresses had just been published, and it's a phenomenal book. But there are absences, and I think that those kinds of absences were also echoed in terms of some of the tutorials I was having, not with yourself, Griselda, because we had developed a very lovely and complex relationship where you would set an essay and I would do the essay, and at the end of the essay I would give you a list of questions which amazingly you replied to. And this is how we established, I think, and I believe, a really deep and meaningful intellectual relationship and friendship that has lasted for decades now. But it was in that kind of context of trying to find my voice in the absence of everything that I was reading and looking at that somehow excluded my voice. And you asked earlier on, how did I come to make Housewives with Steak Knives? And, you know, it just struck me during a studio tutorial with Mari Yates, where, you know, she didn't really want to see the fact that in my own upbringing, I had grown up with a very strong, you know, matriarchal kind of presence in my life. And that, you know, I was surrounded by figures like, you know, goddesses with 4 arms and 8 arms and 10 arms who were carrying weapons as much as flowers and flags and goodness knows what. You know, these were really extraordinary, strong female icons. And I felt that, you know, although at that time, a lot of the feminist practices that I was looking at was quite text-based, I found it really important to make paintings and drawings that disrupted that and in order to reintroduce something really visually visceral for me that was instant and that would transcend the kind of quite heavy text-based work, feminist work that I was having a look at that time. Not that I, you know, didn't admire it or that it wasn't meaningful. Mary Kelly's Postpartum was absolutely important to me, along with other works, but that I wanted to bring in visual imagery that was readily accessible, you know, in a visceral and immediate bodily way. And this is why I felt that reintroducing iconography that came from outside of a Western canon, you know, from the global South, from my own kind of upbringing, was absolutely critical. And it is important to also remember that when I came for my interview, actually, you know, it was just around the time, and certainly when I started at the university, it was just after there were the most massive race riots up and down the country. And indeed, in the community where I lived at the time, in Southall, in you know, the outer parts of West London, you know, in resistance to the government of the time allowing the National Front to parade down our high street, and for a fascist music band, you know, being given purchase to play on what was a predominantly South Asian and Afro-Caribbean area. You know, the South Asian youth burned the pub, the tavern in which the fascist group were playing. They burnt it down. You know, and I grew up in an area in Southall in London where fascist marches took place on a regular basis, where swastikas were daubed, you know, graffitied in various parts of that locale. So, you know, I arrived at Leeds with this background, and I think that what was really important to me was my encounter with feminist literature, and certainly also, you know, reading the work of Frantz Fanon and Edward Said was really my first, you know, port of introduction around, critical race theory, if you like, and then discovering Stuart Hall through Paul Gilroy's publication, The Empire Strikes Back. These were very key insights that they came later in 1983. And in 1981, I was already having those conversations, but couldn't find the literature to support that. I didn't meet Lubaina Himid until the latter part of 1984, by which time you and I were already deeply in discussion. And so, for me, as a student, and having experienced and witnessed what happened with, my peer, and really having to think about why he couldn't see and what we needed to change in order that he could see it, in order that he began to understand the very complex relations between Olympia and Laura, and the very complex set of relations in terms of, Manet's painting of 1863. So these were really important questions for me, and how, of course, that corresponded with Turner slave ship and the beginning of trade, free market trade and economy in terms of the Dutch East India Company, the Portuguese East India Company, the British East India Company. All of these things seem to come together. And, there was evidence of this in paintings and in literature. And so for me, it felt very important to try to stitch those things together.
Thank you, Sutapa. That is absolutely a wonderful and profound and complex account, which I'm going to draw up just one element of it as a sort of springboard for the next, because what you've made very clear is nothing about the structures of power or the injuries inflicted through race, class, gender, and particularly colonialism and empire are external to art. It's not as if the artist is political and brings it into art. You've made it quite clear that as a child of post-liberation, post-independence India, with the long history that your parents had experienced and the experience which you've made so beautifully in your most recent film, Lumen, you already are seeing the operations of these structures of power. And this is one of the crucial things, of course, which is if we identify feminism with something like feminists and women, we collectivize women as if they are all white and straight, right? But what I think you're saying is very crucial, which is the sort of decentering and decolonizing of vision and practice required two things, which I think are what was specific to the moment of the 70s and 80s, and I hope particularly to my contribution to the larger field of feminist discourse, which is it's an analytics of power relations, it's an analytics of the subjective effects of disempowerment or exclusion, or in a sense silencing or indifference or non-recognition. And that you were already there saying, this is already so integrated that when you think about it as an artistic practice, you can't, as it were, take, as it were, the empire out of the Turner already, or exactly where are you looking and what are you looking at. And so I think it's a really important thing for, in the kind of larger sense, to start with knowing that so many different, and I'd say agonistic and agonized positions were already in play in terms of how we were trying to bring certain things to the surface. Now, obviously, feminism and the women's movement is represented as one thing associated with, let's say, white Americans particularly, and then white British artists. And I think what we're trying to say is it never was that one thing. And recently I watched the film Gloria, The Glorias. I don't know if this film about Gloria Steinem, and it's interesting because the alliances that she formed and the ways in which in her activities she was there were always African American, First Nations Americans, Latino and Cuban and other kinds of Americans, part and parcel of the conversations. And there's a wonderful scene in the film where exactly that she's offers to be the minority reporter at all the sort of little, the small groups around this big conference, and realizing that this is such a complex issue. So in thinking about an exhibition coming out of the study of what actually happened in Britain, in a moment of energizing political consciousness, but the political consciousness is a consciousness as much about cultural forms of race, class, gender violence that's being performed, and that the silence of art history about women is just a tip of an iceberg about a series of other silencings. And so your example about Manet's Olympia, because I was inspired by, in fact, you saying who is not being seen, to actually go and find in research the birth certificate of the woman who's known as Laure. We have her name, and she's born in France. She's not an immigrant. She's not an outsider. She's a French woman. She's living in her apartment. We don't know what happened to her afterwards. Whether she became an artist or didn't become an artist or whatever. But that restitution of names and voices, because they are like this constant notion of pivoting the center that isn't a simple center to which you're just adding women, right? And I think going back to the women's movement, it's a much more complex, and it was a very, as you've described it as well from my experience of the women's national conferences, deeply agonized, okay? Because there are women with children, women without children. There are working women, there are privileged women who come down from Oxford. There are a whole series of different kinds of politics, some deeply socialist, quite Marxist, others not. And this is not a uniformity. And so there isn't a sort of point of feminism and then art and then activism that are already formed. There's this wonderful turmoil, I think, that comes through it. And so I think one of the things I want to convey, which is in a sense the urgency and the energy. And then as we kind of think about the legacies of that, obviously we come back to the fact that you've had a very long and sustained career in art practice, but not without its certain setbacks and difficulties, because the institutions didn't learn the lesson that we were struggling to formulate already in the 1970s and 80s. And this is the problem, which is the numbers of exhibitions. So what I want to say, I'm sure that Lindsay's found this, that places like the Whitechapel, places like the ICA became little tiny islands where work by a diversity of women was being seen. That's where I got my art education, from what was coming from America, what was coming from South Africa, to a less extent from South Asia, in terms of building up a kind of much more complex picture of how so many women around the world were engaging artistically with the challenges that we would say feminism articulates about subjectivity, sexuality, economic power, space, where, as somebody wrote to me, said to me the other day, women didn't have a Wall Street crash, but they did have all sorts of crises of a different kind that official history doesn't see as crises. Crises such as, how to survive on the streets of Southall, how to negotiate the immigration policies that were intrusive and violating of the bodies of South Asian women coming to this country, or how to survive sexual predation and rape, how to survive the lack of medical care appropriate, all of these different aspects. So what I hope is that from looking at what happened through art, as opposed to saying there's feminism and then the artists reacting to it, we get a much more sense from centered in the struggle of artists to find voices, to find materials, to break the silence, to shatter the indifference, and we have taken a very long time to arrive at this point, but there is a record, and I'm conscious of time and I'm conscious of other people. And I just want to say one thing about that's why, as a result of the encounters that I had with many students, including yourself, that Rosie Parker and I decided in the 1980s we had to collect all the ephemeral evidence that she had picked up because she was a journalist at Spare Rib and got all the invitations and stuff and was working in London. I was by that time out of London, so picking up other things. We knew no museum and no library would be collecting this material, and that if we did not put it together in our book, Feminism, this ephemera would disappear and the archive would be empty again. And that, I think, is one of the crucial things about how I welcome this show. Probably I have, deep investments in what I think happened, and I've written those down in my own ways. But it's the interesting question that all of you who are running this research project are interested to find out through interviews or research or conversations like this. What was this transformative moment that hasn't been and probably cannot be incorporated into the typical stories of art, because they were shattering the very edifice of that which had made it possible since the 1950s to treat the history of art as a white men's preserve. And so I think that's when I think the legacy of writing Framing Feminism was we just simply knew someone had to keep the archives. And then there would be time when later it would be possible to use it and give a new look in the light of much greater sensitivity now to issues around sexuality and sexual diversity, about gender. Particularly, however, I still don't feel that we confront fully the issues around racial exclusion and indifference to the legacies, which of course is what you and your art have constantly wanted to remind us, that there are more memories, that there are already this kind of entangled network. And when you mention Turner and the sea, and then of course the role of the sea in your film Lumen, the role of the sea central to Lubaina Hamid's imagery, that there is this ocean that is the connection, it's the the graveyard of so many, but it's the point at which people have been transported and trade and cultural exchanges took place. And that's why I think it's very important that we have this conversation as a starter, because the issues of feminism and artistic practice are not art adding politics, but already exposing this politics of knowledge, oblivion, amnesia, forgetfulness, and what feminism I feel I contributed was concepts with which to think, such as generations and geographies, vision and difference, women, art and ideology, differencing the canon. These are concepts with which to try and think a different kind of way of capturing the tensions that are always in play.
Could I just maybe add to that as well? I mean, I think absolutely I agree with you. And, one of the things that, again, I feel very lucky that is that I was at Leeds at the time that I was, because for me, one of the key things in Housewives with Steak Knives is that I photocopied a page from Old Mistresses. Of Artemisia Gentilescu, Judith beheading Holofernes. So it's there, it's squarely and firmly there in my painting. As much as, Rauschenberg's series of white paintings becomes an iconic presence in the background. And so, the flag we can see on this image in Kali, the video work that is in Tate's collection, when I made that, it was actually kind of in dialogue with my having been to Fred's lecture series about, post-World War art in America. And so the materials I was using to create this flag and the dimensions of it were to replicate Jasper Johns's American flag. So, you know, to not leave the canon, but to interrogate it.
Absolutely.
To engage with it and to interrogate it. And as you say, to pull it apart, to make it splinter, and to reorganize it in a way that we can ask different kinds of questions, or the question in different ways.
Right. I think that's a really, really important point, because of course there's a lot of discussion at the moment going on about the recovery of women artists. There's a lot of shows about women artists, a lot of monographs, monographic shows, and even sort of shows such as, you know, action paint gesture at the Whitechapel. And yet the challenge for me is, and indeed as a feminist art historian and increasingly post-colonial queer international feminist art historian, with all these adjectives, these are all question marks I have. It's like a whole series of people always asking me questions, just like Sutapa was, you know, how does this relate to this bigger picture, etc. But exhibitions and indeed research needs to grasp the theoretical and historical and social historical terms that we had to forge to break with these models of the monographic show, because we can add all these women in, but if we don't change any of the terms of adding, we end up with women's, you know, shows of women's art, or there's a debate, you know, in the press at the moment about all women shows. But your work shows exactly that question. As a South Asian artist, you know, you're just as much at home with Vermeer and Rembrandt. They're just as much yours as anybody else's, or Edward Hopper or Jasper Johns. But this question of an artistic practice which is conceptual in the way that it works, but is actually material and absolutely excavating that which is already there and transforming it into a kind of language. And that's what I'm interested in, is what is which has been the challenge of writing about your work over these years. How do we formulate a new discourse that isn't the conventional one around medium, you know, style, form, group, you know, what's your place in art history? Well, I don't want a place in art history. I don't want to put Sutapa in art history. She already knows she's a part of art history. She's already working with it. It's not somebody else to say, oh, I'll find you a little segment, right? And I think this is really important about this question of looking at what happened between the 1970s and the 1990s in the context of the women's movement. It's not that art was the arm of the women's movement, but that actually those of us who engaged with cultural theory and critical art practice were crucially exposing something that would not be visible any other way. And many of the women in the women's movement couldn't see the point of art. So alienated were they from the museum or curation or art history. But it was the practitioners who were saying, no, this is one of the sites of struggle. And we are as much at the forefront of this. We're not activists who turn up one day and make art. This is an activism that's internal to cultural histories. And if everybody's watching, looking at Turner and saying, oh, isn't that beautiful sunset? Or looking at this amazing sort of, you know, painted like Manis Olympia, or even Jasper John's flag, and not saying, wait a minute, when you see the flag in Southall, you see it coming down the street with fascists waving it, right?
Yes.
That are on the way, as you say, to swastikas and to violence, and to the kind of violence, the racial violence of the 1980s in Britain, and the desperation of the communities in their terms to keep their children safe, to keep themselves safe from a government and these people on the street. We have to bring that back into it. Who was the activist? They were, the fascists were the, but the artists are a way of throwing back to the world images of these moments, not as you know, as complex in their form. So your situation there requires as much complex reading of this dialogue that you were having with Jasper Johns, who himself was doing a flag in relation to the South. I mean, and Fred Orton went on to write just an entire book. It took him 10 years about that one painting to remind us how complex these artworks can be.
Mm. I think that's, sorry, I was just going to just maybe add that, I mean, the other part of it is that, you know, exposure to the work of Mary Kelly or Laura,
Mulvey,
thank you. I've had post-viral syndrome recently, so apologies, Laura. You know, but also exposure to through May Stevens, who came to do a talk and who came to do a studio visit, and who very sweetly sent me a copy of Heresies. And so I found out about Faith Ringgold's work and Howardina Pindell's work through Heresies, you know, which is a publication from the States. So, and I, you know, so I think one of the things that I think is very important that you've highlighted is that, you know, our dialogue didn't just stay in one geography. It transcended space and time and history. And for me, it certainly did, because, you know, those were the things I was transcending history when I was looking and encountering, you know, these various images that were being projected onto this on a vast scale in front of me, you know, and through my lectures and through my seminars and through those discussions. So, you know, whether it was, I mean, that book list we had, you know, from Emile Zola's The Night Cafe through to James Joyce's Ulysses, to, you know, we had such an extraordinary exposure to various kinds of literature. And of course, I think one of the important things I learned from reading Zola's The Night Cafe, amongst various Virginia Woolf's works, etc., was the fact that, you know, Zola didn't write The Night Cafe in isolation of a discussion with, you know, the Parisian scene or, you know, with others in France. You know, it wasn't possible for Van Gogh to make the work that he was making, I don't believe, without him being in discussion with his peers. And I think it would be a mistake, I'm not referring to yourself here. I think one of the problems has been that it's assumed often that those of us who, you know, hail from, you know, the global South or from, you know, were perhaps born outside of, I'm British actually, you know, but my passport tells me so. I'm of Asian, you know, ancestry, Indian ancestry. So, you know, I think that it's important to remember what you've said about geographies. And because geographies are so key to how the world is being welded, and it plays such a central part of etymology, language, culture, discourse, measuring, everything. You know, it's embedded in that system. And we can't ignore the fact, this is one of the most wonderful things that I learned, I think, from yourself and from others at least, is that we can't extricate ourselves from histories. And that histories, as you've said, are charged politically, socially, culturally, visually, aesthetically. They're all charged, you know, and it's both, I think it's both a terrible and a wonderful thing, you know, because it gives us so much thought. And I will say also that when you were talking about your archive, you know, around the women's movement, you know, I think probably I learned from you and from other tutors at Leeds. And so my archive includes letters and correspondences, some artworks from the 1980s, you know, from my contact time with Lebena and many others, Eddie Chambers, Rashida Reen, as well as with people like Ivana Blaswick, Sandy Nairn, James Lingwood, Emma Dexter, and I think that, talking about questions of race and gender and sexuality and representation in relation to the mainstream and art history. So I think it's important to ask what happened, at what point, and what was the relationship to capital? And, at what point in the late 80s and 90s did certain kinds of issues, and you've raised that yourself, through framing feminism and in other contexts, at what point did certain kinds of histories and dialogues that were happening begin to be silenced? And I think that this is why, and it's so refreshing to see younger curators to, deeply engaged with these questions again. And, perhaps not before time, but also interestingly, at this particular moment in history and time. Yeah, I think that's all I've got to say.
I think that's perfect. I wonder if we could hand back to the organisers to see if there are questions. There seem to be 5 questions as far as I can see in the Q&A. So obviously people are engaging with that. So I wonder if we should bring in our public, Poppy and Susanna, a little bit.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much, Griselda and Sutapa. It's it's a huge field, and you've just sort of given us a taster into some of the areas that, you both have been examining through the past decades. And also, through this group, what we want to do is kind of pinpoint where we need to go next, and what still needs to be analysed in more detail. So yes, we do have 5 questions, and we might well have some more as well. So if any of the audience members have got something sort of bubbling in your mind, do pop it into the chat. We can also enable you to speak your question as well. If you want to do that, just raise your hand and I will enable your mic. So we have the first question that's come up. I'll read it out. So this is an anonymous attendee. So they say, the question of why there is this interest in feminist histories now that Griselda raised is fascinating. There was/is a period where feminism seemed like a bad object, even on the left, that is, necessarily white, essentialist, classist, etc. I wonder if feminism has now become sufficiently historical that it seems okay to be interested in it again. In any case, I wonder if the speakers have a sense of why this exhibition is happening now, beyond the fact of this particular group of curators being interested in it. Are there other historical forces at work?
In one sense, I think that question is for the curators rather than for us, who are the sources of material for the curators to do their research upon, in a way.
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah, Lindsay, you jump in there.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was just amazing to hear. I've been furiously scribbling notes while it was going. And I think the thing about timing is really interesting, because I'm 41 this year, and I grew up with kind of Riot Girl and that mid-90s kind of American music take on second wave feminism. So that really kind of fueled and started my interest in feminism. And then one of the reasons that I started making the show was I just became seeing younger people come through, so eloquent, so political, so informed, and so questioning about what was going on around them. And I started to look back at my arts education and just got really angry because I wasn't taught anything. And, I went to really good universities, but I wasn't taught about intersectional women's art practice. And I thought if I have the, it's very personal, but I thought if I have the privilege of going to university and still not accessing that information, then what hope does someone have if they can't access that? And of course, there are pockets where amazing work is being done. Griselda's in the room, we know it's happening, but there are still places where this just isn't taught. And I think, so that for me, I wanted to make something really accessible in the biggest kind of space that I could. And I think there's another interesting thing. I'm going to be polite, but when I pitched it, there wasn't massive enthusiasm for the show. It took some getting, it took some negotiation to get it through. And I would say that as the political situation has worsened for women, as there was a big moment where we were thinking about how we talk about abortion and contraception and how we talk about those things in the show. And there were some comments that were slightly alarming in terms of how nuanced we would have to be. And then Roe v. Wade happened and the gallery kind of went, oh, okay, yeah, we see, you can speak in the way you need to speak, because these are still questions that are deeply urgent. So I think it's something about rage of people who haven't been given access, and something about just the incredible worsening of situation for women across the globe.
I would just add to that what I feel, which is that we have to negotiate very carefully between what Sutapa just also said, which is the financialization of the art world to such an extent that women are, by virtue of having been ignored or not collected or not given things, are actually quite a good speculative offer, because they're cheap to buy, and then come along a whole new range of feminist art historians or a new generation saying, oh, these are really, really interesting artists, and of course suddenly their value will go up. So we have to keep that distinct, that kind of thing, from trying to understand what we learn from art and why art emerges at certain times, what its urgencies are, what the languages are. We haven't talked enough about this. I think Sutapa talked very brilliantly about strategically using certain kinds of practices at certain moments, because, the kind of conceptual art became a very important instrument for feminist investigation of problematics, of topics in a certain way, like the postpartum document or Mary Yates's work. At the same time, there's still a need for a different kind of language. So that interest in the complexity is now possible because, in a way, there is no central style, medium, language, etc. Everything is, as Peter Osborne says, post-conceptual. So there's a moment at which this work now looks, in all its diversity, much more critically cutting edge than when it was classified as, this is mainstream, art world stuff, this is things. And this links up, if I can jump to one of the two other questions, also this question of craft, because that's another huge area that feminists made a major intervention in, to say, and I keep saying it to people, the vast majority of the people in the world have worked in abstract art from the beginning of that 30,000 years ago, the 45,000 years ago, and have worked with textile, and have worked with the kind of symbolic power of weaving and of printing and of the language of cloth and all the rest of it. It took a long time for Western Christian, post-Christian art to catch up and stop privileging marble and paint, right? And I don't think it has fully overtaken the art schools to understand this, but this has been, Penina Barnett was one of my very students in my very first or second year of teaching at Leeds, who went on to found the journal Cloth and to be one of the major figures arguing against this art and craft division. Old Mistresses, Chapter 2, Crafty Women, it's precisely when did this hierarchy come around, in which stuff made with pigment on canvas became more valuable than stuff made with needles or threads or looms. So I think, this is an ongoing issue. And one other part from question that I noticed here, which is just about magazines. Absolutely, without the art magazines, and Sutapa just mentioned this about heresies, you know, these are treasure troves of writing. And one of the things I went through in the last few days preparing for this, I went through my entire archive of Women's Report, which is the newspaper that my group, the Women's Lobby Collective, produced, which had an art section. All of my spare ribs, you know, all of my fans, you know, all of my women's art journal things. These are very precious resources for understanding that there was a conversation going on, a community. We were arguing, we disagreed with each other. There were some very painful divisions and scenes as we struggled to try and get our heads around this huge issue. So certainly the magazines were the central organs. You know, where would we be without Rosie Parker's reviews in Spare Rib about, Pauline Barry's founding of the, you know, the Feminist Art News and the Women's Art Archive. These are crucial activities which the institution now need to take much more notice of, because they are key sources. So I agree that the magazines, and, you know, that's where I learnt my trade. I wrote for them. I wrote for Feminist Review. I wrote in Spare Rib. You know, the Burlington, you know, the Apollo, any of the art, you know, weren't just from me. And we finally got into, you know, even when Lisa Tickner got into art history, she was abused for daring to talk about bodies. Her work was called pornographic because she dared to talk about, you know, artwork in the body, and that is in the, you know, the early 80s, etc. So I think these issues are still very, very lived by students in art schools, because they haven't been, the whole legacy of feminism hasn't been integrated in, as Lindsay's saying, this is something that got taught to people. And
I would just, sorry.
Go on.
No, sorry, I hate to interrupt you. I would just say as well, I think magazines and zines are absolutely fundamental to the exhibition. And I'm so excited about showing people what there is, because they've been some of the hardest things to get hold of. So I've done a huge amount of research in places like the Glasgow Women's Library, the Feminist Library, Althea Greenan as a library. And one of the first things in the first room is a 9-meter vitrine with just this glut of information. And I found these, I'm Scottish, and found these incredible things like the Tayside Feminist Newsletter and the Inverness Women's Times. And what I really want to do is show this incredible urgency and diversity across the country. And I think furthering that, there are also incredible newsletters like, or very important magazines like Mukti. You know, Mukti, I think, deserves a show of its own, and will have a large feature in the show. FOAD, the magazine newsletter for OAD, and things like the Black Lesbian newsletter. And so there's this wonderful way in which the immediacy and cheapness of printing, and certainly at the time, you know, you've got places like Lentil Road print workshops, you've got See Red, you've got people who are coming together to fight a political fight and using kind of print as a tool to do it. So yes, that's going to be a really big part of the exhibition.
There's another question that you might be able to speak to, Lindsay, which was about the title of the research group and why it, well, one person asked why women's movement, not movements, and another one was asking about the geographic inclusion of practices across England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales.
So in terms of the title, movements is actually a really good suggestion, and I might nick that. But I was conscious of not calling it women's liberation movement in the same way that I was conscious of not using the term feminist, because I didn't want to exclude women of colour. And I think the women's liberation movement, certainly at the beginning, was very much kind of dominated by white women. You know, you have people like Gerlin Bean at the first conference who then go and start Brixton Black Women's Group. And of course, those voices are there and they are critical and go on to do critical things. But I felt like calling it women's liberation movement might feel a little exclusionary in that way. And similarly, using the word feminist would mean not using the term womanist. And I didn't want to close down before you'd even got into the show. So I thought keeping it quite loose at this point. I mean, it is a feminist, hopefully womanist exhibition, but I wanted to allow ways in and allow people to kind of make their own spaces. And in terms of is it nationwide, I've tried my very best. So there are artists from Southern Ireland, one from Northern Ireland, from Scotland, from Wales, from Birmingham, from Newcastle, all over the place. But what I have found is that so many people settled in London at that time. A lot left again at the late 80s for reasons that are really fascinating. But so we will touch on activity all over the country, but it has been unavoidable that a lot of it is in London. And I would also add that the question that's been raised by Sutapa and Griselda about capital and about the late 80s is one of my absolute obsessions about the show. And this hugely this moment I find really difficult around YBA starting and around the market just expanding and exploding, and what that does to completely, and I'm not saying it's the artist's fault, but what that market does to hide everything that was happening. The attention goes to YBA. I spoke to Labena Hamid about it, and she said that when she went to Frieze, that opened, so Damien Hirst's first exhibition that opened in Bermondsey in 1988, she said she knew that moment for her was over. She felt like everything, she could see it was going to shift away from this interest in grassroots politics. And that would be my next exhibition, is like what happens when that work starts. So I'm hoping we'll have lots of really interesting discussions about that throughout the show.
There is a really great question here also about Griselda's MA Feminism and Visual Arts course, which I think would be really great to talk, maybe just answer briefly, Griselda.
Okay. Okay. There was a moment in the early 90s when I suddenly realized that even within the radical context of the social historians, the Marxist historians, and the tolerance that they had for my doing what I was doing at Leeds, there was always, maybe one session on race and one session on gender, or else in some, story, some big course on modern art, I was allowed to do one session on women artists. And I suddenly realized that the whole thing had become so complicated. There was such a depth of writing, such a depth of art, such a depth of historical research that was needed. It needed a dedicated MA. And in the teeth of considerable opposition and hostility, I set up this dedicated MA in feminism and the visual arts, which was commonly known as MAFEM, which sounded like a kind of, women's hygiene product. Everybody joked about that, and we all felt very fine about that one. And the idea was that you needed to have a toolkit of major writings by a full range of feminist writers, white, black, straight and queer, and international. So you had some conceptual tools for understanding what feminist thought and theory was. You needed to have a relook at the whole history of particularly 20th century and 21st century art with women in mind, not as additions, but from a completely different baseline of what the issues are and how women negotiated them. And then a session on kind of how you mobilize contemporary critical thought and theory in relation to contemporary practice, which of course wasn't modernist anymore. It wasn't pre or postmodernist. It was already something completely different, and the conditions of production were different. And it was open to artists or people trying to transfer into art areas from other subjects, to art historians. And the model was, what would be a feminist pedagogy? What would be a methodology for no one to feel lonely, excluded, or unable to speak themselves, to have the voice, as Sutapa says. So it involved a radical rethinking of how we would interact in the group, as well as what we would be studying, even though I was always insisting you have to be empowered by dealing with tough theory, because theory is what enables you to break through the opacity of the capitalists, of the sheen of capitalist market and the blandness of art historical discourse, and what was preventing us grasping aspects. And so it included feminist Marxists, as well as all the people. So it became, as I say, a toolkit, a historical refiguring, and an engagement contemporary practice. And out of it, we got, some people did practice and made work as a part. Some people wrote curatorial essays, some people wrote art historical essays, some people wrote theoretical essays and dissertations. And then in 2004, I think, my department said, we don't want specialist emails things anymore. You're not recruiting enough numbers, we'll just cancel it. And nobody said, you've just removed from Griselda her entire raison d'etre, right? But it was because what happened, and it's a simple answer, which is in the 80s and 90s, when there were young women and some young men who wanted to engage with feminism, there were enough people teaching in the art schools who knew about this and who would say, oh, you need to go to Leeds, that's where you'll get the MA you want. By the end of the 90s, there was already, oh, you don't want to be doing that feminist stuff, there's nothing interesting in it, it's not got anywhere, etc. So young people were not being given the information by their tutors to find a way to this. And so the numbers went off, and that was crushed. And it was one of the most, and it still is rather, if you want to see the damage to my heart and my mind of this, it was that no one in my school said, you can't do this. This is historically important. This is the whole legacy. But we found a way around it, and people still kept coming and then would take my feminist options, because so far as I could offer them. But it's a very interesting thing. There was a moment, and then it rather like I think it's about 10 years after the YBA phenomenon, the flash people in art schools just said, no, feminism, not interesting, there's nothing to it. And we'd hardly begun. So thank you very much for that question. But the impact of that is out there in every single person who passed through it is doing something with its legacy. And that's all you want to have happen. And no doubt there are students learning within that. And you're right, pedagogy, I was inspired by Augusto Boal's pedagogy of Paula Frere's pedagogy of the oppressed, Bell Hooks's major work on pedagogy, Beverly Brown, Bettina Aptica, lots of really crucial people who are rethinking what the power structure is in the classroom, and that every cell of society is already infused with the structure of that society, and it has to be changed at that level too.
There's another couple of questions that point to something to maybe look at in future sessions about social media. So one person talks about their experience of social media kind of not being social media of craft showing diversity that isn't necessarily reflective of reality. And they still feel the exclusion that Sutapa talked about during her time in the 80s at art school. There was another question that wondered about any dangers that we should be aware of around the institutional interest in monographic exhibitions on women artists, particularly of the Global South. And I suppose there's always a danger of kind of radical work being incorporated into, the market or into the institution. So that seems like quite a pertinent question that we could perhaps look at later. But I don't know if anyone had any sort of first thoughts on that.
Well, if Sutapa was, I'm watching Sutapa sort of nod her head or think about it. We get caught. I mean, the thing about feminism, we get caught in these terrible dilemmas. Every single woman deserves to have as much visibility and understanding of her project as every other artist, right? So I'm not going to moan and say no, mustn't have monographic exhibitions, because the experience of a monographic exhibition is you get a chance to see, like we've just had these wonderful shows of Lubaina Himid's work and Sutapa's work, how somebody works over a lifetime of developing and expanding a practice and finding new languages and certain consistencies. So there's something profoundly important on that, and you have to see the work. And a monographic exhibition brings lots and lots of work together that you would otherwise not ever physically encounter. One of my great griefs is about the Artemisia Gentileschi, which I managed to be locked out of twice. All my life I thought, I'm going to actually see these paintings I've talked about side by side. I'm going to feel, the presence of this hand and the scale, and why is this one bigger than that, and what does it feel like to be with it? And I couldn't, because of, each time there was a lockdown and I missed that exhibition, and I'll never get that experience again. So absolutely, I welcome people who dedicate themselves and wonderful exhibitions. I mean, the Saluda Choker that they had finally, from this wonderful abstract artist from Lebanon, or Farin Nesser, the Turkish artist, etc. All of these things which I'd come across, and I finally saw lots of the work and stuff. And yet, at the same time, a part of me is thinking, there's some young curator saying, oh, here's another old, dead woman artist from somewhere else, I will get some funding. But that's capitalism for you. It is corrupting at every level, but we have to negotiate it because it's the condition. So long as you keep your eye on some sense that you are not just shaped or determined by the conditions of production, you negotiate them and keep open the space. But I mean, somebody just sent me this thing that, the National Gallery just opened up Cézanne, Van Gogh and Picasso, or no, who is it? Cézanne, Van Gogh and somebody, after Impressionism, not a woman in sight, right? And yet on the other side of the, the channel, there's a Suzanne Valadon show, a monograph. So I think your question is a really good one. We don't know how to negotiate this double bind, right? And so I think it's very interesting to look at how each curator finds a way to not fall prey to how to market them, but how, in a sense, for the public to see work and have themselves experience these very, very much broader sense of these projects. But you have to have curators who say, this work is about something. This work is coming from somewhere. This work requires you to understand some deeper context in which this artist is working. And I find that that's where they kind of quarantine feminist stuff as if it's intruding. It's not relevant. And that's going back to my Mayfem, how I wanted to frame an entire, not a methodology, but a set of frameworks within which we understood art is doing something. And each artist who spends a lifetime doing it doesn't do it in order to get, oh, tick, you're at number 52 in the world's greatest artist rank. Sutapa now has a thought.
I do. I was resisting, but I mean, I think one of the, I was so blessed to be able to have these two really major shows recently. And it's, as you also mentioned, Lubaina, Veronica Ryan, Ingrid Pollard, but also, you know, and one of the things that was fed back to me, for example, by Jana Graham, was that she said, you know, Shispa, it's so great to be able to see your work together. And not all of it was, I mean, made so much work, you know, we had to select pieces. So in other words, it wasn't everything, or it wasn't all my work in those shows, but she said it was, you know, it was really the first time that so much of my work was able to be in conversation with each other, so that, you know, viewers could understand the depth of one's practice, hopefully, in the way that other kinds of spaces have been privileged. And I guess that, you know, another example of this would be, for example, you know, the experience of encountering Charlotte Salamon's work, for instance, you know, to be able to understand the depth of history and moment, and what this artist was experiencing and seeing, and how she was seeing it, and what, you know, what her thoughts were. It was so important to be able to encounter that as a whole, you know, for the work to speak to each other in the context of this solo exhibition. So, you know, these are privileges that have been occupied by men forever, you know, male artists. And I'm so sorry you missed Gentileschi's show, Griselda, because it was phenomenal. And, you know, it was phenomenal for so many reasons. When I first saw Gentileschi's Judith beheading Holofernes, I saw it at in Florence, in the Uffizi. And I mean, it just knocked my socks off. But the shocking thing was that it was almost in one of the basement galleries, you know, and it's a remarkable piece of work. So for it to have been given that exposure, and, you know, for us to be given the opportunity to really encounter some of her love letters, some of her, you know, her paintings, some of her drawings, all of these things in relation to these extraordinarily huge scale works that were executed so brilliantly, you know, that nobody could argue with the skill and the genius of this woman. So, and yet she connected so much with the history and events and her personal history of the time. You know, these are the things that are silenced unless we find spaces to do that alongside, you know, other kinds of exhibitions. But I'm a great believer in the monographic show. And I think, again, you know, Lebaina's recent exhibition at Tate Modern wasn't, you know, Joan Jonas was, you know, two incredible opportunities to look at and consider the richness of practice. Indeed, I wrote about Phila de Barlow's work quite recently. Sadly, she passed away. And, you know, again, to see her work dock in the Devine galleries, right on the Thames, and the subject, you know, the title dock, manifests itself in a way that we can't extricate it from the Thames and the history of the Thames and all that has come in and out of that, you know, of its docks, its river, its waters. So I think it's, you know, one poem is rich and you can gain so much from it, but to read an entire book of poems it just transforms your life in ways that you can't anticipate, I think. And I think for me, you know, experiencing a solo exhibition, a monographic exhibition of women's art, of work by a woman artist, or artist who's a woman, is really important. Absolutely.
I think, Lindsay, do you have a final comment? And then I think we'll round up.
I think another really important thing is to always have a very healthy suspicion of institutions, and however you approach them, to think about why they're doing that show. Not that you can't enjoy it fully, but just kind of having that awareness that there are other things at play. And I think one of the ways that that's kind of manifested in this show is that I've been really, or me and Hannah and Zuza, there is an urge for the institution to say, aren't we amazing? We're doing a show of feminist art. And I keep saying, no, we're making the show because we messed up. Like, this is a reparative show. And we have to be really careful about the balance of celebration and holding our hands up and saying, we excluded these artists, because Griselda's completely right. You know, during the 70s and 80s, the Whitechapel was showing work, even the Hayward. The ICA is like a mile away, half a mile from Tate, and it was showing show after show that was incredible, and Tate just didn't bother. So I think it's really important that there is a kind of honesty and communication about those things.
Absolutely agree.
Well, because so much was happening regionally as well. And hopefully that's something we can look at in this research group, and is already being looked at through projects such as a Tall Order Rochdale Art Gallery in the 80s, which is on at the moment. So I will wrap things up, unless there's any... Oh, Griselda, I think you're speaking, but you're on mute.
I just want to stress, because that didn't come up, but I mean, Leeds, Sheffield, Nottingham, Norwich, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Bristol, the Icon in Birmingham. If I want to do a map of how did I find out what was going on, it was by getting on the train and going around the country. And often those curators were way, way ahead of the central ones, who were intimidated by the grandees of the central, the London establishment, etc. So, sorry to interrupt. You want to say good night, and I just want to say something for the regions, because those of us who've lived in our regions all our lives, it's quite good.
Yes, exactly. There's been a lot happening here. So, I mean, we could go on all night, really, but we're already 10 minutes over. So, just to recap, because I will put, I've got the group's info, the group's contact info there on the screen. So do follow us on social media. And also, if you want to sign up to the mailing list, you can get in touch with us on the email address on screen. And also contact us with any questions that you think we should be addressing. So as Zuza mentioned at the start of the discussion tonight, one of the aims of the research group is about generating new research and forming collaborative relationships across the country. So what we're wanting to know, who were the artists making work in this period, how were they connected in ways that may not be currently visible, and obviously what was the impact of the social political movements on the artworks, not just in terms of the content, but also the materials, working processes, and dissemination of the work. Magazines and zines is a good example there, newsletters. And also, why are and have been these stories so hard to find? What are the factors that led to artists and their artworks disappearing from public view? So we would really welcome people getting in touch with the group to share their research, to point out things that we haven't been talking about yet, to connect us to people who were maybe part of the conversation in the 70s and 80s, but have sort of dropped out of visibility. Maybe they were making work and as artists, and then they went into a different career, or whatever reason, and we'd really like to hear from them and sort of add these different voices to the conversation and the research. So yeah, thank you once again. So to Griselda Pollock and Sutapa Biswas for generously coming into conversation with us and sharing their experiences tonight. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to listen to you and just get our brains sort of buzzing and whirring about some of these problems and what we need to do next. So thank you to the audience. We've had a fantastic turnout, so thank you for coming and being so active with your questions as well. And so do connect with us via the email address. I'd also like to thank British Art Network as well for funding the research group. Yes, I think that is about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Griselda, and thank you all.
Thank you, Sutapa. It's always a joy. And Lynn.
Susa, Poppy.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll end the public session now and I'll reopen the practice session if any of the panelists want to sort of meet back. Okay, goodbye everybody. Thank you.